World War II claimed over 400,000 American lives. Every soldier who went into combat carried a rifle, a sidearm, grenades, something to defend themselves. That was the rule. You don't survive war without a weapon. But one man proved that rule wrong. Private First Class Desmond Doss walked into the bloodiest battle in the Pacific Theater carrying nothing but a Bible and his faith, and saved more lives in one night than most soldiers save in an entire war. May 5, 1945, Okinawa, Japan. The place was called Maeda Escarpment, but American soldiers had a different name for it. Hacksaw Ridge. A 400-foot sheer cliff face covered in jagged rocks, defended by thousands of Japanese soldiers hidden in caves and fortified positions. The mission was simple on paper: climb the cliff using cargo nets, take the plateau on top. In reality, it was a nightmare. Dozens of men fell before they even reached the top. Desmond Doss, 26 years old from Lynchburg, Virginia, climbed that cliff with his battalion from the 77th Infantry Division. He was a combat medic, but unlike every other medic in the U.S. Army, Doss refused to carry a weapon. Not because he was afraid, not because he didn't believe in the war. He was a Seventh-day Adventist. His faith taught him that taking a human life was wrong, even in combat. The Army thought he was crazy. His fellow soldiers thought he was a coward. But on this day, Desmond Doss would do something no armed soldier could. Growing up in Virginia, Doss learned his beliefs from his parents. His father was a World War I veteran who struggled with what he'd seen in combat. Young Desmond took the Ten Commandments seriously, especially, "Thou shalt not end life." When Pearl Harbor happened in 1941, Doss knew he had to serve his country. He just couldn't do it with a rifle in his hands. He enlisted in April 1942, right after marrying his sweetheart Dorothy Schutte, telling the Army he wanted to be a medic. The Army didn't make it easy. During basic training at Fort Jackson, South Carolina, his unit treated him like an outcast. They called him a coward, a slacker, someone who didn't belong. Soldiers threw boots at him while he prayed at night. Officers tried to get him discharged, claiming he was mentally unfit. They put him through every difficult task they could think of, hoping he'd quit. Doss never quit. He completed every exercise, passed every test, carried his share of equipment. He just wouldn't touch a gun. The law protected his right to serve as a conscientious cooperator, and he held firm. By the time his unit shipped out to the Pacific in 1944, most soldiers still doubted him. How could a man without a weapon help them in combat? They were about to find out. The 77th Infantry Division fought through several island campaigns, Guam, Leyte, and finally Okinawa in April 1945. Each battle, Doss proved his worth. While other soldiers fired weapons, he ran through the fighting to reach wounded men. He bandaged injuries under hostile fire, dragged soldiers to safety, and stayed calm when everyone else was panicking. Okinawa was different. This was Japan's last major defense before the home islands. The Japanese military threw everything they had at the American forces: artillery, machine guns, mortars, hidden positions, and caves. The Americans needed to take strategic high ground, and Hacksaw Ridge was the key position. On April 29, 1945, Doss and his battalion began the assault. Using rope ladders and cargo nets, hundreds of men climbed the cliff face while Japanese defenders fired down at them. Many didn't make it to the top. The ones that did make it found themselves on a plateau of destruction. The ground was torn up from artillery, visibility was poor, and enemy fire came from every direction. For days, the Americans fought to hold their position on top of the ridge. Doss worked constantly, treating wounded soldiers right in front of enemy positions, then pulling them back to safety. He didn't sleep much. Every time someone called "medic," he ran toward the sound, not away from it. May 5th was supposed to be a day off for Doss. It was Saturday, his Sabbath, the day his faith required him to rest and worship. But that morning, the Japanese launched a massive counterattack. Artillery and mortar fire rained down on the American positions. Machine gun fire swept across the plateau. The fighting was intense, close range, desperate. Dozens of American soldiers went down, wounded and unable to move. The battalion commander ordered a retreat. They couldn't hold the position under such heavy fire. The Americans pulled back down the cliff to safety. All of them except one. Desmond Doss stayed on top of Hacksaw Ridge with the wounded. He could hear men calling for help, crying out in pain, and he couldn't leave them. His commanding officers assumed he'd come down with the others. When they did a head count and realized Doss was missing, they figured he hadn't made it. No one could survive up there alone. But Doss was very much alive, and he was working. He crawled from position to position across the plateau, finding wounded soldiers who'd been left behind. Some were unconscious, some were too hurt to walk. Doss bandaged their wounds, then faced his biggest problem: how to get them off the cliff. The cargo nets were still in place, but climbing down while carrying a wounded man was impossible. Doss came up with a solution. He found rope, fashioned a litter system, and began lowering men down the cliff face one at a time. It took strength, technique, and nerves of steel. Doss would tie the rope around a wounded soldier, secure it to a sturdy point, then slowly lower the man down 400 feet to where other medics could take over. Then he'd pull the rope back up and go find another wounded soldier. Enemy fire continued around him. He ignored it. After each successful rescue, he prayed the same prayer: "Dear God, let me get just one more." One more became two more. Two became five. Five became 10. For several hours through the afternoon and into the evening, Doss worked alone on that plateau. He pulled men from shell holes, dragged soldiers across open ground, carried some on his back to the cliff edge. He didn't stop to rest. He didn't stop to eat or drink. Every time he thought he was done, he'd hear another voice calling for help, and he'd go get one more. By the time night fell and the Japanese stopped their assault, Doss had lowered 75 wounded soldiers down Hacksaw Ridge. 75 men who would have been left behind. 75 families who got their sons, brothers, and fathers back. When Doss finally climbed down the cliff himself, his hands were torn up from the rope, his body was exhausted, but he was alive. Hook! When the battalion saw those wounded men being lowered down, they couldn't believe it. Soldiers who'd been presumed lost were coming back. The medics below worked frantically to stabilize each man as he arrived. Officers kept asking, "Who's doing this?" When they learned it was Doss, the man they'd mocked, the soldier without a weapon, everything changed. His company commander, Captain Jack Glover, found Doss and apologized. He said he'd been wrong about him, that Doss had more courage than any armed soldier he'd known. The Army scheduled another attack on Hacksaw Ridge for the next day, Sunday. But Captain Glover made an unusual decision. He delayed the attack. The men refused to go back up without their medic, and Doss needed time to observe his Sabbath and pray. So the entire battalion waited while Private Doss held his worship service. When he finished, he told them he was ready. The second assault succeeded, and this time the Americans held the ridge. During that second battle, Doss continued his work. He saved Captain Glover's life by deflecting an enemy grenade away from him. He rescued more wounded under fire. Then a grenade exploded near Doss, and he was finally hit, shrapnel wounds in his legs and arm. Even wounded, he treated his own injuries and waited for other medics to evacuate more seriously hurt soldiers first. They finally got him down from the ridge, and he clutched his Bible the entire way. Desmond Doss spent months recovering from his wounds. The injuries were serious enough that he couldn't return to full duty, but he'd done what he came to do. On October 12, 1945, President Harry S. Truman awarded Doss the Medal of Honor at the White House, the highest military decoration in the United States. Doss became the first conscientious objector to receive this honor. Truman shook his hand and said the nation was grateful for his service. The medal citation detailed his actions: 75 casualties evacuated, repeated acts of outstanding bravery and unflinching determination in the face of enemy fire, devotion to duty without weapon or regard for personal safety. The army that once tried to kick him out now held him up as a symbol of courage. His fellow soldiers who'd thrown boots at him during training wrote letters praising him as the bravest man they'd ever served with. Doss returned to Virginia, reunited with his wife Dorothy, and lived a quiet life. His war injuries never fully healed. He dealt with hearing loss, tuberculosis from exposure, and other complications for the rest of his life. He didn't seek attention or fame. When people asked him about Hacksaw Ridge, he'd say he was just doing his duty, that God gave him the strength to save those men. He passed away in 2006 at age 87. His story stayed mostly unknown for decades until filmmaker Mel Gibson brought it to the big screen in 2016 with Hacksaw Ridge, starring Andrew Garfield. The film showed a new generation what faith, conviction, and courage look like. Veterans who served with Doss confirmed the movie's accuracy. If anything, they said, the real events were even more remarkable than what Hollywood showed. Why does this story matter? Because Desmond Doss proved that strength doesn't only come from weapons. That conviction can overcome doubt. That one person committed to their principles can change outcomes even when everyone says it's impossible. He saved 75 lives without taking a single one. In a war defined by violence, he became a hero through mercy. The men who came down Hacksaw Ridge that day went home to their families. They had children, built careers, lived full lives, all because one medic refused to leave them behind. Those 75 men became hundreds of descendants. The impact of Doss's actions rippled through generations. That's the real legacy. Not just the medal, not just the story, but the lives that continued because one man believed he could get just one more.